Welcome everybody for this afternoon's seminar in the Digital Classicist series. Very pleased to introduce Charlotte Tupman today. This was actually going to be a double act, so I'm going to call out both names on here. Victoria Moul and Charlotte Tupman, both from King's College London, Department of Digital Humanities. Both of you.
Victoria is in the Department of Classics.
Victoria from the Department of Classics and Charlotte in the Department of Digital Humanities. And the seminar today is Neo-Latin Poetry in English Manuscripts, 1550 to 1700. Charlotte, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Well, thank you all for being here today. I'm very chuffed to see so many people here, as Helen said, on such a sunny day. So I hope not to detain you for too long. Yes, this was originally going to be a presentation with Victoria Moul of the Classicist department. She's a lecturer in Latin language and literature, and unfortunately she wasn't able to be here because she's ill. She sends her apologies, and I hope that I'll be able to do justice to some of the things that she was going to talk about. I'm going to talk about a project that hasn't yet been funded. We've applied for European Research Council funding for this project, ideally as a 5-year project. And the reason why we wanted to present to you today is that we wanted to ask for your feedback and your thoughts on the project that we propose, because we're obviously still at a stage where we can make changes to our plans, and we'd be very interested to hear what you think of the project. So first of all, I'm going to talk a bit about the kind of materials that we're working with, the aims of the project, and some of the challenges of the project. And then I'm going to be concentrating on the digital aspects of the project, including the digital publication. Neo-Latin poetry Neo-Latin is the Latin that was used from 1500 onwards till about 1900. That's the main span of Neo-Latin poetry, but we're concentrating on 1550 to 1700 because that was the main period in which Neo-Latin poetry flourished. Neo-Latin poetry was a central part of the cultural landscape of early modern Europe. It was considered to be an essential element of good education, and it helped to establish links of patronage and favour. It was common across Europe, not only in this country, but across France and Italy and elsewhere. And it provided a way of linking literary cultures together and encouraging interaction between them. It was a common medium for political comment as well. But despite all these things, it's been actually very little, surprisingly so actually, very little studied. And one of the interesting things about it is we don't actually know what's there yet. We're not quite sure what we're going to expect to find because it hasn't really been studied very much. So that's a little bit of background. Here's a nice example. This is from a manuscript in Cambridge. This is just to give you an idea of what some of the manuscripts look like. You can see the address there, scriptorium.english.cam.ac.uk. If you want to go and have a look, some of you will be familiar with the Scriptorium resource already. They publish high-quality images of some of these manuscripts. I think they have quite a large collection there themselves. And so this is just to put you in mind while you listen to the rest of the talk. So the materials that we're looking at are, by and large, they're private notebooks. They make up the largest proportion of our materials. Things like commonplace books and collections of manuscripts. Some of them were added to bit by bit over the years. Some of them were bound together in collections, either of just manuscript materials or sometimes manuscript and printed materials were bound together, either perhaps for convenience or for storage. Some of the notebooks are literary, most of them are literary, and some of them are devoted specifically to verse. And they contain a mixture of authors. Some are very well-known authors, Some are completely unknown or only known from these particular poems, and they might be friends or acquaintances of the person who compiled the manuscripts or the owner, if indeed, of the manuscripts. So it's a mixed bag. And we've also got instances of scribal publication. This is where the scribe will copy something out as a form of publication because the material is unsuitable in some respect for print. So, for instance, it might be religiously controversial or politically controversial, and sometimes the scribe would put this material together and publish it not in print but in a manuscript. So, what about the poems themselves? Well, we're not really sure yet, as I say, what we're going to find. But Victoria has come in, please. Victoria has obviously done quite a lot of research in this area as a preliminary for this project, and she suspects that they'll fall under these three headings. Short epigrams, short poems usually in elegiac couplets, hendecasyllables or iambic metre. Elegies, poems of praise or lament in elegiac couplets. And odes, lyrics in metres usually adapted from Horace or from his later imitators. So this is what we're imagining we're going to be working with. And we think we also might find verse letters, satire and epilia, which are short narrative poems. So, we're going to focus just on the Neo-Latin because there's a huge amount of material here. And we're going to obviously be discussing related materials, but our primary focus in terms of transcription and translation and commentaries is going to be the Neo-Latin that's found in these manuscripts. And some of the Neo-Latin that we find will be contemporary to the manuscript, and some of it will be previously written Neo-Latin, which has been taken up and used for the manuscripts that we're finding. So it'll be both contemporary and slightly earlier Neo-Latin. So what do we want to do? Well, primarily, the overarching point of the project is to understand the role of Neo-Latin poetry and its political and social significance. We want to produce a digital edition, which I'm going to be talking about, which will have translations and commentaries, and this is important for a representative sample of this material. And the reason why we said that is because there's so much material that we're not sure how much of it we're going to be able to deal with. So if we can try to produce a sample that is, broadly speaking, representative in terms of ratios of different types of genres, that's what we'd like to do. We want to, as part of that digital edition, which will include these translation and commentaries, we want to encode links to related data sets, which is becoming ever more important and interesting as more data sets are produced, and enable other scholars to link their texts to ours, which again is something we've been doing in other projects recently. And we're also, of course, going to produce a series of print publications. They include a monograph by Victoria and a series of articles written by the project team, both the experts on these manuscripts and also the experts on the digital side of things, that will analyse and contextualise the poetry. We've got sort of three main areas of analysis. We're going to look firstly at the form and the function of the poetry. So we're going to, this will actually be the first scholarly analysis of the role of Neo-Latin poetry in England in this period. So that in itself is quite exciting. But we're going to look at analysis of the most popular genres for the composition of this poetry and the themes or subjects in which they deal. We're going to look at the kinds of occasions to which these poems react. So they might be political occasions, for instance, and the typical modes of address. We're also going to be looking at the classical and later Latin authors with which this material was engaging. Links between English and wider European Latinity, and the role of earlier Neo-Latin poetry, for instance in France and Italy, in the English literary culture of the period. And the idea is that this kind of analysis will feed the commentaries that we're writing and will also draw on them. So we're hoping it to be a kind of iterative process. We start writing commentaries, we discover more material, or we absorb more material, and we add to the commentaries, and we produce a wider analysis on this basis. So that's the first section there. Then we're going to look at the relationship of Neo-Latin poetry to vernacular English poetry. We're going to focus on parallels in genre or subject, and on the literary significance of the very common practice of transcribing Latin and English versions of the same poem. We're going to look at why that might have been done. So, for instance, there's English poetry from the late 16th century by very well-known authors like Shakespeare and Marlowe, which attracted a great deal of scholarly attention, not surprisingly, but the parallel Latin genre has received almost no attention. So we're trying to redress the balance a little bit with that and work out what the relationship is between those. And so we want to understand whether better understanding of the Latin literature helps us to interpret contemporary English poetry this time, and vice versa. A large proportion of the extant manuscripts in this period include at least one example of a parallel translation. So we want to understand what was at stake in this practice and why it was performed so frequently. And again, this analysis should enable us to produce commentaries to the poems. And then finally, in terms of the areas of analysis, we want to look at the political significance of occasional Latin poetry. So poetry that's written in response to a particular event, or to deliver a particular type of message. There's an example of, from the collection you saw earlier, actually, the scriptorial materials from Cambridge. There's a manuscript, two manuscripts in fact, which include several Latin poems about the trip of Prince Charles, who later became Charles I, to Spain. He went incognito to Spain to try to obtain a marriage which would have been politically helpful. And people responded in England by writing Neo-Latin poetry, and so we're interested in why they would do that. Why did they respond in Neo-Latin? Latin poetry of this kind often relies heavily on classical allusion and is often quite sophisticated in its political use of that. So we want to understand better what were the conventions of Neo-Latin poetry and how can they help us to understand this. It's particularly noticeable that politically engaged Neo-Latin poetry hasn't been studied much, so which I find very surprising, but this is one of the main reasons we're interested. Okay. Now, in all of that, we can expect to find a few challenges, we suspect. Firstly, in distinguishing between the different types of Latin verse. So, firstly, distinguishing between extracts of classical verse and Neo-Latin poetry these days shouldn't be so difficult because of the resources that we have available to us. That represents a slightly less challenging thing. But distinguishing between contemporary Neo-Latin verse and pre-existing Neo-Latin verse of a slightly earlier generation is probably going to be much more difficult to sort out. So we need to, that's one of the things that we're expecting to be a challenge in terms of working out where these fit into the picture. We're also expecting to have challenges on the matter of authors and attribution and provenance. course, common to all manuscripts really. One of the problems is that manuscript material of this period often doesn't record authors. We have anonymous compilers, and we also have cases where we have parts of manuscripts bound together later. So we have a collection that wasn't actually really a collection at the time, but it's been turned into a collection. And we even have examples where attributions aren't correct. So we can have to be quite careful there, particularly when thinking about how to represent those in the digital edition and how to encode them. Okay. So that's giving you a bit of background as to the kinds of questions that we're looking at, what we want to do in the project. So what are we doing? What's the digital aspects of the project, and how are we approaching them? Okay. The first thing that we want to do, and I think this is, I thought that it was worth talking about this as well as the resulting publication, because I've worked on a number of projects at King's where we've been training project partners in using the Oxygen XML editor to encode their text in XML. And Oxygen is great; it does, everything we want it to do pretty much. But it does involve quite a lot of training. It involves the project partners being willing to learn the computer language XML and to encode using Oxygen, which has a lot of features that don't relate to what we would want to do in this kind of project. And of course, if you were using a more editor-friendly interface, you'd still have to train them how to use it, but I suspect that it would be both less time-consuming and also a much more pleasant process for the editors. Now, over a 5-year project, I think it's fair enough for the editors to want to have an interface that they're happy using. But quite apart from that, we would also be interested in producing an interface that did everything or almost everything all at once in the same place, rather than having to use many. I can see a lot of smiles at that concept. Of course, we're not the first people to think of this. There are many people already working on this, and we want to work with people who are already working on this. We don't want to do any reinventions of the wheel. We want to make sure that we're working with people who are already addressing these questions and trying to help them come up with something that will be beneficial to all. So there are a number of options. We absolutely haven't decided yet, not least because this project hasn't started yet, what basis we're going to have for this editing platform. But there are a couple of possibilities. Perseus, which is being run by, it's a project part of Perseus, which I'm sure that you're all familiar with, which is looking at using open source tools for annotation and editing XML, text in XML. We've also got a project at Prince Edward Island in Canada called Islandora, which we've had some contact with in the past as well. They're trying to pull a lot of aspects together in that they're interested in how to edit, how to display, how to use their interface for actually analysing the text, managing triple stores and so forth. And they're also looking at OCRing and automatic tagging as part of what they're doing. And I think that's something that I want to ask everyone here about, because I personally don't know what the state of OCR for Latin handwriting in Latin is. I have no idea whether that would be appropriate for this project, but it would be interesting to talk to you about it. Because, for instance, things like Islandora do offer the possibility for, once it's OCR'd and checked, for automatic tagging of certain features, which I think would be really useful for things like potentially names and places. That sort of comes out as an obvious thing that might work. I don't suppose it would be particularly possible to do that for things like genre and meter. but I don't know yet. We're interested in tackling both historical and mythological names and places. Let's talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So the idea is that the interface will be developed at the beginning of the project in collaboration with the project planners, and then there'll be a sort of iterative process of testing the interface and seeing how it can be improved. And as new material comes in, if we want to do something different we hadn't thought of at the beginning, which I suspect is definitely going to arise in a project like this, then hopefully we'll be able to develop that in order to improve it. And regardless of who we end up working with on this, we're going to be making available the editing interface as one of the outputs of the project for other people to use. That's what we're planning to do. Okay. We obviously want to do what we can with linked data, but of course we don't know exactly what we're going to want to link to yet, because we don't know exactly what we're going to find. Obvious candidates will obviously be names and places, but we have an interesting situation because we will definitely have names and places from the classical world, and we've got well-established or soon-to-be established projects working with ancient names and places. We've got the standards for networking ancient prosopographies, which we will definitely want to work with. We've got quantities for places, Pelagios for drawing together data sets that relate to the ancient world. That's all fine, but we've also got the question of what do we do with names and places that are contemporary to our manuscripts, so from 1550 to 1700. What resources are we going to use for those? And again, coming from a more classical background as I do, I don't yet know very much about those the resources that we might want to use for that. So that's going to be something we're going to need to investigate. There is some, these are also the external links that I'm going to talk about to start with. So we've obviously got links to images, where we've got images such as on Scriptorium and elsewhere. We would want to link to external bibliographies from commentaries. And there's an online dictionary in Latin, which we might also want to link to for specific terms or specific words if we're discussing those words perhaps in commentaries. So these are sort of examples of external things that we might want to link to. But we also want to look at relationships between, this is going to sound familiar to a couple of people here, looking at relationships between these poems and other texts, or between parts of the poems and other texts. I think this is an ideal project for that kind of work. And again, I think I would want to try to find a way to do this in a more friendly way for the editors who are going to be working on these. I'm imagining something like being able to highlight a section of text, right-click and choose your relationship, rather than going in and adding various bits of markup. Of course, you will be adding the markup, but you'll be doing it from an interface. It will all be underlying XML, a little bit like papyri.info uses, so that the editors will be marking up the text, but using the conventions that they're used to, rather than having to go and learn the underlying code. So we might want to link, for instance, to resources like Perseus, other online collections of related texts. But we also wanted to define what those relationships are. We don't want to just say this is related to this, we want to say what kind of relationship it is, because it seems to me that this is quite a complex, potentially complex set of relationships that we're going to find in these texts. I should imagine we'd want to use something like the SOAR's use, the Sharing Ancient Wisdoms project, use of the relation elements to underline what we do with our relationships. Because I think it worked very successfully on that project, and the Perseus project that I mentioned earlier is actually now using the Sharing Ancient Wisdoms ontology for its own project on text reuse, and they're finding that it suits their needs very well. So what I'm imagining is that we'll do something like, we'll use relation as source uses, but we will go through the ontology in great detail, and as part of the project we might adapt the ontology slightly to what we need for this project. I think that's actually one of the things that Saunders was hoping people would do, and I can imagine that this project would be an ideal use case for that. So for those who haven't seen Saunders, I'll just explain what I mean by using the source relation element. So I've added this in because the TEI guidelines are now using an example from the source project on relation, which I'm very pleased about, and I take every possible opportunity to let people know that. And I've just repeated it down at the bottom in slightly bigger writing. It's probably still pretty small, but just to explain how it works. What we're doing is we're using unique references for the person or bibliographic reference responsible for making this assertion. Each of these scholarly assertions about a relationship between one text and the other, or a snippet of text and another snippet of text. And here we've got a reference to biaf.org, which is the Virtual International Authority file. And it's a place to store unique IDs identifying individuals essentially. And 44, 33, 55, 36 is Charlotte Wilson. Obviously I have encyclopedic knowledge of all various so I can tell you that straight away.
Oh, nice. I must put that on my cards.
And the ref attribute contains the reference for is variant of. Now, is variant of is one of the relationships defined in the ontology, and if you go to that URL, you can, if you point your browser to it, you can find a description of what that actually means, because all of the terms and all of the relationships that we used in the ontology are stored there and are described. And we had 3 years worth of meetings about exactly how to describe all these terms, because as you can imagine, any project like this, it's always going to involve people having different views on what a term could possibly mean, really to a much greater extent than we expected. And so one of the things we'll have to do in this project is make sure that we're happy with the terminology that Source uses if we want to use it for this. And if we're going to develop it ourselves, we have to make sure that we agree on all of the definitions and we're going to use. So that's what ref is, it's a description of the relationship between the two texts. And active and passive are references for each of these two texts. Active is the text we're starting with from the Sharing Ancient Wisdoms site, it's one of our texts there. Passive is a text which is found in Perseus. And the reason why we've done it like this is because each of these produces a unique ID, so there can be no confusion about what we're talking about. We're actually able to point to a very, very tiny portion of text. We can break it down to a sentence or a group of words in a sentence or a word. Even, I believe, it's possible to break it down to a letter, if you really wanted to. So this allows us quite a good range of options for identifying very specific bits of text and being able to describe the links between them. So yeah, I've already said this. We need to discuss how we're going to do that. I just wanted to say that the ontology we use for Source is actually based on two established ontologies, one from the world of cultural heritage, one from the world of bibliographic records, further rooms, lovely name. Yes, and again, we're expecting to have to refine these terms, and then if we do revise the Source ontology and adapt it, we will also publish that as part of the project, so that again, other projects can use that. It's going to be another one of our outputs. Yeah, here's just a list of, these are just a few examples of some of the relations. I mean, there are many, many more. You can go and look at the ontology if you really want to. There's a human readable version of it, and which Anna produced. And these are some of the things that might potentially be relevant to us and also some of the relationships that describe people as well. We might find that these would be relevant to our project. So I certainly think it's worth starting with this. So that hopefully gives you a general idea of the kinds of things that we're hoping to do. But there are some other aspects which I'm not sure whether we can include or not really as part of this project. It'll depend how long everything else takes. We might have to consider these as future wish list items. But one of the things that struck us might be useful or interesting would be to invite others to annotate our text. Now, part of me feels that given how little attention these texts have had, there might not be enough interest to do that, sadly. Although, the other side of the coin is, once we've published this, once we've done something with it and brought it to people's attention, perhaps there will be enough interest for others to come in and want to do some work on our text as well, or to add their own comments on the texts. We're not sure yet, but that might be a possibility. And if we are thinking of doing something like that, we need to work out how that would work, because unless we're going to allow completely open annotation of our text by anybody who wants to do that, we're going to have some kind of editorial board to decide who's going to do that. And obviously that needs to be somebody who's got the time and is being funded, ideally, to do that. So that's a possibility for the future. Obviously, one of the things that it would be extremely interesting to do would be to look at comparing our poetry with Neo-Latin poetry elsewhere in perhaps another projects. I mean, we will in part be doing that in this project, but we're obviously not looking in massive amounts of detail at Neo-Latin poetry that was created elsewhere, and I think it would be very interesting to do that. And something that interests me personally, actually, is looking at related genres, for instance, poetic epitaphs, and potentially the relationships that might exist between those and the epigrams that we find in these manuscripts. I'd be really interested in doing that. But as I say, I suspect we probably can't do that as part of this project. I might have to think about getting funding for something like that. And so, obviously, some of these epitaphs would have influences from the classical, which are also found in epigrams from our manuscript. And in this case, how would we go about defining those relationships? I think it could be very interesting. Yeah, I think that was all I was going to say. I would really love to hear what any of you might think about this project, how we might improve it, any ideas that you might have. And obviously I'll answer any questions that I can. So
before that, we should just thank Charlotte and let her catch her breath back before she gets interrogated. Charlotte, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I was sitting in the wrong place because I couldn't see the screen. I was getting a crick in my neck trying to follow it. So I'm going to have great pleasure in looking at your slides afterwards. And just to remind everybody that at this stage, when we move into the less formal part, we are being recorded, so bear that in mind if you say anything. And the video, slides and audio file will appear up on the website in a couple of weeks along with the others. I've been writing down a host of questions down here, but I'm going to start off with one observation, then a question, and then I might let somebody else have a go. Firstly, I'm very, very pleased to see the attention that you spent to the relationships within this, because as we all know, relationships are such tricky businesses, right? Particularly if you get them wrong, they can be very, very problematic. Yeah? So I'm glad that you spent some time looking on that. That went a bit flat, didn't it? That's my best gag for my database class, that one. But the first thing you need to do is to make a selection of your material. And this, as you pointed out, is clearly a very marginalised area. And you've got to come up with a representative sample. Good, I tell my students that as well with their projects. To look at this towards a pilot, hopefully, and with the successful conclusion of this project, there may be possibilities to develop it further. But initially, you've got to make a selection of your material. And I'm going to be quite literal when I ask this, and where do you actually find it? Are we talking about boxes in the basements of libraries?
From what I understand, there are a lot of these manuscripts in Oxford and Cambridge, in libraries, and in the US and in Manchester. And that is what, however, I didn't really want to say this, but Victoria will know a great deal more than I do about, obviously, where these manuscripts are found. So she would be able to give a more accurate answer. My understanding is that they're held in libraries and they're available to be studied by scholars who are interested.
I think what will be fascinating is when you open the box, what you're actually going to find in there. Are these like, this is something to do with medicine and it's in Greek, therefore it goes in the Galen pile. I mean, you're going to have all sorts of esoteric stuff mixed in with it all, I would imagine. I look forward to finding for Victoria what will you actually find, but she's going to be delving in archives in the basements of libraries.
I think there's going to be a lot of sorting to do.
But is there a list from which she's working? I mean, do we know whether there's a sort of initial bibliographic exercise that's been done?
I know that she's already done quite a lot of research herself, and obviously some of that will be published as part of this project.
Yes.
So my understanding is that she herself has a very good idea of the kind of exactly what materials she's going to be working with.
So would you start with your first item being a list of as many as, a catalogue of as many as possible, and then a more detailed analysis of some of them?
I think that's exactly what the plan is,
Even the catalogue won't be anything like comprehensive.
No.
Victoria was talking to Amelia about this a few months ago, and she said it was, even doing a catalogue of all the Neo-Latin manuscripts would take longer than this 5-year project, and we wouldn't have done anything interesting.
I think we're having to be extremely selective, but we're expecting, as part of this project, to be able to certainly to publish many hundreds of Neo-Latin poems. So.
And I suppose the cataloguing area is where crowdsourcing might come in a quite straightforward way, that you invite librarians to contribute. We've got this funny thing in our collection. Here at last is a place to put this piece of information.
I think that would be potentially more helpful than using crowdsourcing for asking annotations. Absolutely.
It's really sort of communicating with the library community and saying, have you got stuff that belongs to you? Including not just big national collections, but sort of small private personal collections that are going, in, as it were, National Trust houses, all sorts of things. All these people are holding on to that. This kind of stuff isn't all in conventional libraries, I think. So I think people might be rather grateful to have a place to put the information.
I hope so, and actually,
and a format to present. If you present a format saying this is how we want a manuscript of or even a folio of this kind to be presented, that's enough. That would help.
You were wondering about the resources for prosopography for this period, non-classical prosopography. And it just so happens that when I was giving a paper about statography in Oxford last week, someone came up to me afterwards and said, do you think we could use this? I've got this massive prosopography taken from Neo-Latin manuscripts. And I made a note of this person's name, so I'm hoping I've put out a call on Twitter for all the people who were there to remember who that was.
Well, obviously that's really good news.
I mean, the answer is that they don't announce it.
No, but the point is that they're thinking about that, and we might be able to work with them, and that's, thank you, that's really good news.
I wondered a little bit about your comments about crowdsourcing, if I can be a little bit speculative. So you said, if I can summarise and possibly misrepresent, that if you were going to crowdsource annotations to this, that would need some kind of editorial intervention, and therefore that would need to involve some sort of funded position. I wonder if we could unpack that and make that, I mean that would certainly be one model, but another model might be crowdsourcing completely openly without any editorial intervention whatsoever, and the annotations living in a sort of standoff place and saying these are annotations that come from the outside world, we give them no weight. But that's where they come from.
Yeah.
And another model might be you have an editorial board, as you say. The editorial board is made up of scholars, like the editorial board of the Papyrological Navigator, for example, who do so as part of their prestige, just as they would edit a journal or something. So they take it on for 2 years at a time. Whether you find enough people willing to do that is another question.
That might go well.
You could combine those models, couldn't you?
Why 1550?
1550 to 1700 is the sort of the main period in which this kind of poetry is found.
If there's a particular person who did something in 1550 and you're sort of saying this is the first thing we're interested in.
That might well be the case.
That's Victoria.
I'm afraid that would be another question for Victoria. I'm hoping that she'll be able to see this video perhaps, and obviously I'll report back to her the questions, but it'd be great if she could also see this and might be able to respond individually to some of these questions as well.
It struck me when you go to look for money, you might want to do it 2 stages, having a demonstration or small, and say, look, this is what we can do, and there's all this other stuff somewhere else. And it struck me that to justify your selection of a small area, you do the same sort of thing as these clever people do when they look at birds in the sky. They pick a small area, and there's an algorithm which makes them say that is represented, we can therefore work out the whole is, and the same will be in astronomical looks. So there should be an argument there, I think, that you could apply to say why what you've now already done is worthwhile expanding into a larger area.
Well, thank you. I think one of the reasons for selecting those dates was in order to narrow down the sheer amount of material that we'd be dealing with. I think obviously we could expand it a little, but for fear of having too much to deal with,
I think that's right.
those,
That's right. Yeah. You can justify what you're doing.
Are you specifically excluding stuff that was published in book form? So if you have Milton's notebooks, you don't include the Milton poems, or?
That's an interesting question. The answer is I don't know. We might, well...
I mean, your catalogue, well, you'll have to mention it, won't you? You'll say, you'll get item so-and-so, see archive.org.
I think we probably have to concentrate on just what's in the manuscripts, but with reference obviously to published poetry as well, of course, in the commentaries.
Also, if you come to an item that was published, you can just say it was published and move on to the next one.
And there are going to be differences and variations from printed final codex and the manuscripts as well.
But that might not be what they want to focus on in this particular project. And this particular project, they may just want to say, we're not going to talk about this, because they say manuscripts, they may be wanting not to talk about ones that exist in book form, but to focus on the others.
It's going to be different. I mean, you're studying the manuscript, you're making a catalogue of the manuscripts, and whether if that exists in a codex form, then that's something else, and it's gone through some editorial process and print process, so it's not actually what you're interested in. But you found an area that's been very under-researched, because it's been marginalised. Do you have any sense of a reason why it may have been marginalised, or not?
I'm going to say...
Or perhaps just accidental in the fact that this is not a fashionable period. What I'm thinking of is, at this period I would have imagined that Latin would have been the prime legal language. So the political aspect to it you mentioned for the political poetry, I could see there being a huge amount of political satire written in Latin because it's a language of the legal process. And I think that will be fascinating, and I'm a little bit unsure why that's not been picked.
Can I just chip in as someone who works in the area? It's largely because the people who study the period can't read it. and the people who can read it don't study the period.
Precisely.
Okay. Right.
Well, that's been the case since about
Yeah.
1920, I suppose.
Yes.
Before that, they could do
Before that they could,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
But classicists tend to be very snooty about anything
exactly.
written after about 300 AD.
Mm.
And early modern scholars, by and large, don't have the linguistic skills to approach it.
Because this is written for a very specific audience, because if you were educated, you could read Latin. So the poetry is only pitched at educated people.
And educated men as well.
Educated men, sorry, correctly. Yeah, actually, you've got an educated male audience for this type of poetry. And I can see things like political satire being very, very high on actually what you find. Maybe completely wrong. But,
No, I think that's one of the main questions I think the most want to focus on is the political use of this kind of poetry.
I want to pick up on references to mythology. Where are we with that big Swiss-French lexicon project, which is now online, isn't it? Though mysteriously I don't quite understand the way it's online, but it's called, it was produced, like so many things in life, unfortunately, for art historians, but it's the Lexicon Iconographicum. But they discovered that if they were going to have a lexicon of all these funny pictures in ancient art, they'd actually have to have an entry called Aphrodite, or whatever. And so they then wrote these enormous things, which turned out books that cost a fortune and were that size. But there is now a not wildly user-friendly database online. And what I don't quite understand is that there's the Swiss thing seems to be online, and then there seems to be a French subset, I think separately funded or something. It's some kind of sort of French exceptionalism. But it has seemed to me for some time that that's given that that stuff's out there and underlying it is some really, really good research, it could be a useful route into a structured way of looking at mythology. Because you don't want to waste too much time on it, and you don't want to use things like, what's that 19th century dictionary that's online in Percy's? I mean, that's a bit of a waste of time. It'd be better to be able to go to this lexicon.
Okay, I'll definitely find out how that's progressing.
There is an image component in this manuscript, and is it relevant? I mean, there is interaction between images and words, and are you interested in the images as well?
We're very interested, but they are going to form part of the project. We thought about that, and we suspect that dealing with images would be sort of yet another aspect of the project that if we wanted to do it properly, we probably wouldn't be able to do that necessarily as part of this project. Having said that, obviously, if there's an image already existing online or in some kind of resource that we can link to, then that's great. We'll do that. But we're not going to do high quality scanning of the pages or anything like that as part of this project. Or at least not under the bid that we've put into the ERC. Of course, if we don't get that funding, then we could perhaps apply elsewhere and bring that in if we decided we wanted to do that. But we seem to have so much already to do that we were a bit wary of dealing with images as well. But of course, it would be tremendously interesting.
You're going to have to go into manuscripts because you're going to want them annotated, and you're looking at possible OCR.
We are, but this is all possible. I don't know yet whether that's going to happen. I don't know whether people are going to be transcribing in the library. No, seriously,
Really?
I don't know. We don't know yet. We don't know.
Beyond Scriptorium, what other sources of English manuscripts are there currently online? I mean, have lots been digitised? Have none been digitised?
I don't think very many have. I think you might know better than I do, in fact.
English manuscripts, more than Latin ones, but yeah, I don't think a huge quantity.
I meant English, just manuscripts in England,
Yeah.
which is what I'm thinking. I mean, has there been lots? I mean, I'm sure some people digitised. But there's this terrible tendency to go for things with pictures in,
I'm
isn't
just
there?
going to have a look, and I might be able to tell you. Just give you to look at the document.
I work on them a bit too.
Yeah,
and it's sort of haphazard. There's actually a lot of facsimiles in print going back to when people did that sort of thing. Individual libraries are starting to do a lot of this. There are places like the Folger, for example, that are starting to digitize a lot of theirs. One thing about this is that manuscripts are not easily distributed, or evenly distributed. The British Library, Bodleian, Cambridge, Huntington, Harvard, and Trinity College Dublin have a great majority of them. And some of these places are interested in digitizing things and some aren't. Traditionally, people doing English language literature have actually had a bit of an aversion to manuscripts.
Yes.
So they sort of were not highly interested in them. More recently, there's a lot of interest in them, but sometimes there's a feeling that there's something valuable there that you don't want to give away.
Yeah.
But the thing about them also is that few of them have interesting pictures.
Yeah. Yes, so they don't go. Very noticeable at the BL that they put up all that stuff with pictures in. Just uses up the space that could otherwise be useful words.
Yeah, and the example you showed, Charlotte, of a manuscript is also typical of ones from the 17th century, in that the script is something that you have to learn to read. There are beautiful ones with a nice italic hand that do not require any new learning, but you have to have been careful to do that.
Because I'd have thought one way that you might select your material, end up selecting your material, might be, I mean, if you're looking for a random selection for a pilot project, perhaps you just choose things where the manuscript happens to be available in digital form. On the other hand, if that turned out to be largely at the Folger or somewhere like that, it might be seen as less European. Because that's a political
They all wrote in Neo-Latin, consciously not writing in classical Latin.
Well, look, there are examples in these manuscripts of classical Latin as well, so directly taken from classical Latin pieces, but I don't know. I mean, there's a big mixture. You've got a mixture of writing in English and classical Latin and obviously Neo-Latin things as well.
Neo-Latin basically is classical Latin.
Yes.
But
distinguishable, but there will be neologisms or something, or neologisms, new words, or different construction and stuff. Well, no, I mean, I don't know.
It varies. I mean, syntactically it's identical. Yeah. There are neologisms, but only when the author needs to, obviously.
Yes. America or something.
Yes, or gunpowder.
Oh, really? Okay.
But these men went to an education system whose main aim was to enable them to write like Cicero and Ovid.
Yes. So you can't exclude them. I'm trying to capture them.
No, they do find it dividing now.
Concrete will be in both camps, we treat public, if they have a they have a political character, you said some of them have that, it seems to me you probably want to find more than one example of the actual text, because otherwise it's just someone writing the book themselves, which isn't exactly something that a political message would have. Well, that wouldn't be how you'd write it.
Yeah, we don't know yet to what extent we have some different copies of the same text yet. Yeah. We don't know. It's one of those things where we don't really know what we're going to find yet, but obviously in some cases we might have copies yet. I don't know whether this is, am I allowed to ask a question?
I was just going to go on to that. I was going to say, particularly for the benefit of the camera, it would be really good. You wanted to get some information from the audience. If you have questions for everybody, not only for the audience here, but also on video. And there'll be your email details, I'm sure, on the slide, so that anybody watching this online who actually would like to respond to Charlotte, then please do email her. But I think if you could just repeat the questions and the things that you were wanting to know about.
The thing that I was actually going to ask is actually directed over here, if you don't mind. Would you find this kind of resource, as a digital classicist and as somebody who has never worked on Neo-Latin poetry, I'm really glad that you're here, because I would love to know whether you would find this kind of resource useful for your own work. Is this something that you would value being produced? And can you see yourself using it?
I think it's an incredibly useful resource. I think in my own work at the moment, I probably would use it actually, yes, for what I'm specifically working on at the moment. But I mean, in the future, I can see it, on future projects, I can see it being invaluable. I mean, the thing is, when you're working in the field of English Neo-Latin poetry, you're part of a tiny community of scholars, but but also just accessing stuff is very difficult. And there are all sorts of questions. There are all sorts of questions relevant to what I'm doing at the moment that are unanswerable without the kind of resource that you're talking about. I mean, when you're looking at a printed Neo-Latin source, there's no real way of knowing how unique it is. There's been no work done that enables you to contextualise it in the Neo-Latin context. So there are all sorts of incalculable benefits that it will provide, I think.
That's really good to know. Thank you.
And it's often the more pedestrian things, just producing lists and giving things identifiers, really boring stuff that is absolutely essential. That's really liberating to people, because then then there's a place to point at where this stuff has been listed and as I say, identified, given identifiers, as in a slightly more structured and consistent way.
Also, it's nice to have editions of texts and commentaries on texts that aren't just published in a book that footnotes this text as volume X or whatever. That if you really wanted to go and look at it, you'd have to go and get permission to dig around in their basement and find it yourself, and no one ever will. To actually bring all of these things together, not only write the commentary but provide the material and index it, the identifiers and all that sort of stuff, all in the same place. Because no one wants to just create a catalogue. By the way, maybe do, but you guys don't. We want to do some fun stuff too.
But that's why I'm wondering whether the ones they choose to expand on should be the ones that are available, where the manuscript's available in digital form, so that you could then demonstrate the whole process. That you choose the ones in scriptorium or any others that you can find that are out there online, and develop an entire editorial process. You might then identify other ones that you also wanted to work on, but that as a category, because it would set up standards for doing this kind of thing, that might be particularly interesting.
Well, you want to do the digitalisation as well.
The other spin-off of this that may come back down your way as well, that I think if you produce the material and you get it up there online in an effective way, in an engaging way, then it will stimulate, or have the effect of stimulating interest in that area, and you'll get more people to perhaps come into that area, which is another thing. We've seen this happen in other areas as well, and you'll get new people coming in because the material is available, and they don't have to go and camp out in the basement of the library.
And also crucially because it's edited and translated. I mean, the number of people with the linguistic skill to read untranslated, unedited Latin is very small, and nearly all of them are working with classics.
Something I would like to say while the camera is rolling, and something I really should have said right at the very beginning, actually, is to thank Victoria for bringing this project to the point at which we've applied for funding because she came to see us at the Department of Digital Humanities with this idea for the project, and we've merely helped her to develop the digital side of things to fruition, or hopefully to fruition. Not merely, but what I'm saying is that she has done an enormous amount of research in this area, and I'm really, what I'd like to say is that I'm absolutely delighted to be working on this project with her, because I think it's a really interesting project. It's another thing that she can't be here today, actually. I know how much she wanted to.
Yeah.
Just before we switch camera, would you like to repeat your requests to our wider universal audience for things that you're interested in? The OCR information about Latin characters.
Yeah,
People have very, very short attention spans. If you said it at the beginning, they'll have forgotten it by the end, yeah?
No, I'd be interested to know what the state of optical character recognition for Latin handwriting is. If anybody knows anything about that area, I'd be very interested to know, just out of interest. And also, I should say that we'd also obviously be very interested to hear from other Neo-Latin scholars, even though I know that there are very few, because we'd really like to take account of what you find interesting about a project like this, and any feedback that you might have about this presentation.
The only thing that comes to my mind with regard to this, and it's not specific, it's not for Latin OCR, but it's for handwriting OCR in general. There is a project at UCL, a European funded project with European partners. It's a spin-off from the Bentham project, the transcription one, and it is looking at OCR for handwritten manuscripts, letters and things like that. I'm not sure, I think they only started last year, so I'm sure it's very, very early days. I'm not quite sure what degree of success they've had, but maybe chase those up for you. Okay, let's just thank Charlotte one more time.